if you aren't getting that counterbalance in those external rotators, it can lead to like a slightly more traumatic shoulder injury.
It pulls your hands in sort of gravity backwards. And this is why you do that sort of scorpion technique where you want to kind of face pull and arc your body in.
Welcome to another episode of the Anatomy of the Climb, where Dan and I provide feedback, breakdowns, and demonstrations on how to improve your climbing based on viewer submissions. This, of course, is Dan Bell, professional climber, coach, and just overall very intelligent, nice human being.
And this is Jason Hooper, mender of fingers and fixer of broken climbers.
And this episode is powered by coffee and brought to you by Kaya. Let's get started. Okay. I forget what this one's called. The name's probably not that important. Let's see. And it's over. Ooh.
Yeah.
So it looks like they got the run part dialed in, but they forgot the jump part.
Classic dilemma.
The most important first move is where his foot's going to land, and it's at the foot for a second, and then there, now our gaze is directly up, and
clearly the combination yields.
Not ideal results.
But dude, A+ commitment.
I wish we had the sound on this too, because it is a very fine noise.
I love it. Thanks for submitting it. I can't really tell which climb he's trying to do here. I sort of assume it's this green one. But it's not that high. Like even running just square directly into the wall, he's like, he's a little ways down, but were he just standing on the volume, he would almost certainly reach. So you don't really need to jump. I think that's a big thing with run and jump type climbs in general, whether it's like as part of a competition route or to initiate a climb or something like that. So often all you have to do is like step up on the hold, and you only need to carry enough momentum into the wall to keep you from falling away. You don't really need to like charge at it. Kind of ties into as a whole, like momentum moves need to be done smoothly more than quickly. And so just kind of finding your pace is going to do you a lot better than just trying to go as fast as you can.
So now we have Kate on flesh prints.
Ooh, I love the mime dance. Excellent.
Got to prepare the hips.
Yeah. Oh, dude, visualization's key, and
it's all
fun.
in the hips. That's from something, I just can't pinpoint it right now. Happy Gilmore. Classic.
Adam Sandler with the climbing tips.
Gosh. All right. Looks pretty smooth so far.
Heel, good mobility.
Well, and there goes the heel.
Yeah.
Bye. So in prior episodes, we've talked about how important it is to be able to keep the foot externally rotated to pull directly into the hold. And we've also mentioned sometimes that we get like this internally rotating, our internal rotation of the femur as we pull into it, just because we don't have good activation, say, of like the glutes or the bicep femoris muscle to keep us more externally rotated. And as such, the adductors fire and turn us more into the wall. But sometimes it's not even that. Sometimes it's just the range of motion or flexibility of our hips. So you can kind of see her hip flexion angle here never really changes as she's trying to pull herself over, which may mean that she doesn't have the needed external rotation of the hip as she tries to flex further in, which may be the cause of her knee falling into the wall, which then pops that heel off immediately. So let's go over a quick drill that we can use to actually improve our range of motion in this position, which may unlock this movement and get us to send. All right, so this is one of my favorite drills for working on some high feet, but more so even like high heel hook positions. You want to find like a box that's appropriate height for you. In fact, you can change the height by even just adding some plates onto it. I like to keep a plate on it because you can actually place your heel right in the center and pull off of that as you're doing this motion. So I'm gonna have Alina set up with her heel on the weight. So the heel is gonna be right in the middle, and she's gonna stay as squared up to us as we can. So the down leg is staying squared up, and then the heel is nice in the middle of the weight. And what she wants to do is place this arm on the inside, because that's gonna actually allow her to drive that knee even further back as she rocks in. The knee is gonna naturally want to track in, so that hand helps to kind of keep pushing it back to gain even further stretch. So as she rocks over onto the heel, she wants to actually be engaged with this, like she's pulling through the heel, which is where the weight comes into play, because she actually has something to pull into. And she'll feel the stretch all through the hip and the groin, but it's really helpful to work on those high heels to not only practice engagement, but also the range of motion. So basically a 2-for-1. As she progresses at this height, she can just add another weight on top of it or find a more appropriately sized box for her. The knee is going to want to dive in because that's going to be a slightly more comfortable range of motion. That's where we use the arm on the inside to help drive it out. Now you want to think of active engagement like the hamstring and the glutes to do that, but it's nice to not only have like a little barrier here or to just get a little deeper in the stretch, you can guide with it out. Now I'd actually keep your elbow bent, there you go, so you can drive through just the arm. Yeah, there you go. So drive through and then keep that, and then you can even like kind of mime your move, like you're pretending to do a move with that other hand or whatever you need to do to set up for the next move. And just make sure to try and keep your hips squared up too. There you go. There's a bigger stretch, huh?
Yeah.
So everything is like squared up as you rock over. And again, the way to progress this is to use something higher and higher as you can tolerate it. It's a good stretch.
Yeah.
Let's check out Sesame Street Direct by Ethel. Wait, where is this?
This is in Squamish.
That's what I thought, yeah. Squamish.
Right next to Thigh Master and somebody's problem.
Thigh Master?
Thigh Master. He gets some leg squoze. Squoze? Some leg squoze going on.
Did you see that guy? He looked pretty disgusted. He was on the video. He's like, ugh, you're recording.
That's how you learn.
Right. Good mid-back strength there.
Yeah. I mean, she's cruising it so far.
Yeah. Oh! All right.
And away.
Looks pretty good from that point. So that last part is just kind of an interesting tidbit with our shoulders and something that I don't see trained very often in climbers, but also something that I see leads to two different type of injuries. Not saying that doing this is going to cause her to be injured, but obviously trying to hold this move as she cuts her feet, she is kind of compressing between these two holds, which means that her shoulder relatively is going to be compressing an internal rotation here, which means a lot of activation of the subscap. Now, I don't see a lot of climbers actually training that position, so we generally have some weaknesses there. If that's the case, like she's just not gonna be able to like generate as good of compression between these two holds, which will make that move as she cuts a lot harder to try and maintain. But more importantly, I actually see some like subscap strains from positions like this because the feet cut and all of a sudden they're really loaded trying to pull in, and they just overload that muscle that hasn't been targeted much. But another kind of interesting and opposite tidbit with that is the role of the external rotators. So in the back of the shoulder, as you're trying to generate and compress into these two holds, if you are pretty strong and you're pulling really hard into that compression type movement, you need counterbalance from the back of the shoulder. If you aren't getting that counterbalance in those external rotators, it can lead to a slightly more traumatic shoulder injury, which is where especially Cuban rotations come into play. Why is that? Again, because she's in an internally rotated position to make this move because of the compression. And the nice thing, which we can demonstrate later with the Cuban rotations, is a lot of the focus on the external rotators is when the shoulder is more internally rotated. Compare that to like a face pull where most of the resistance occurs when you're in mostly an externally rotated end range position. Yeah. So just useful tidbits, like it's great to train face pulls, but Cuban rotations are also super helpful, especially for movements like this. And it can certainly be worthwhile to add in some internal rotation strength training at these end ranges to stabilize your shoulder even more.
So kind of beyond the point of kind of shoulder rotation, which I think will really help out with this crux sequence up here. There's just a couple little points. First, I really like how she sets up for these first couple of moves. We've touched on this in a number of other videos, and I think we got some more coming up today. But this is a perfect heel hook. Look at this knee position. Look at that foot position. It's great.
Looks very in line, yeah.
Yeah, toes out, heels perpendicular to the hold she's using, good hamstring and glute activation, really clamps down on it, and the movement off of these holds just looks really clean. Good accuracy, very little excess momentum, resets, yeah, just really nice climbing through the bottom. So, a couple little points through the end. First is these shoes have a decent toe hook section, but anytime you don't have a full rubber upper, you gotta be really careful with how you place your toe hooks. She gets really sabotaged by kind of lining up here onto the leather portion of the shoe. So the toe hook's just a little too deep. So you can kind of see it slide as she sets it, and then kind of damningly more as she comes across here. Once both of her hands are over to the right, it's between difficult and impossible to reset this toe hook. So at this point, I think she's kind of realizes that she's a little compromised in engagement, and there's kind of just not much for it other than to try to fight through. But were it not for that slide, this sequence seems like it could work very nicely. But taking a cut on two holds that are facing kind of in the same direction, there's just nothing other than that internal rotation and sort of close compression to keep things controlled and on the wall. So be careful with your toe hooks. Aside from that, this seems like a pretty conscious choice of hold. I typically try to look for two things when I'm doing a cut move as much as possible. The sort of wider your hands are, the thicker your hinge is, the easier it is to control side-to-side swings. Additionally, having a hold that is angled in such a way that you can kind of directly fight the resulting swing. I guess, you're going to swing this way. You want to have something that provides a counterforce. Anyways, it'd be much easier for her to cut and move her feet here. I think that is a way that other people do this climb, but it makes sense also that she bumps to this down pull to give her more of like a kind of plumb line hang to move her right hand. But at this point, her right hand is now kind of a liability rather than a benefit. So if she were to move her left hand back to this side pull at this point, she would now have really nice compression between these two holds, not nearly as close together. And it would be a lot easier to resist the toe cut, whether intentional or accidental. So that's kind of the biggest tactical difference that I would make here. That said, another way that you can kind of go about breaking down these climbs, especially if you have a project coming up or something that you're trying to climb in a relatively short window, super useful to use an app like Kaya, who is today's video sponsor. We can just hop in their search tab here, search for Sesame Street Direct. All right, so watching Amanda on the same boulder here, we see that she actually avoids the issue that Ethel runs into entirely by not using the toe hook at all. This seems to produce a much more streamlined method that does, however, look kind of powerful and a little bit snatchy on some of these moves. One of the cool things, though, is that we don't end up needing to take the entire sort of beta from other people, but can kind of mix and match to our heart's content. I personally think it would be pretty cool to do the start of this the way that Ethel did, using the toe hook to kind of streamline this kind of intro section so that you don't have to be quite so snatchy between the side pulls, but then using Amanda's method for the finish to keep the cut sort of to a minimum and using the wider side pulls to help kind of control and streamline the finish.
Yeah, I think that's my favorite part of using Kaya is I just like to borrow one or two moves that I think will work better for me. Kaya now has more than 35 guidebooks available to you on your phone with GPS, which means no more getting lost reading directions from an old guidebook that tells you to hang a Louie at the dried up riverbed. Which,
so many.
Using the GPS feature, you can actually have directions from the parking lot to the send, which means less time wandering around and more time climbing. And speaking of sends, there are currently over 300,000 beta videos on Kaya, but the greatest part about that also is that the videos and maps can be downloaded for offline use.
So we're actually really psyched to be working with Kaya for this video. They're a company that we honestly believe is making really useful tools for climbers of all types. We're good friends with the development team and the founders. And I actually wrote with my friend Eric Bissell the Bishop Area Bouldering Guidebook, so we have a lot of ties to this company and really believe that they're doing something good for the community. As fun as it is to sort of explore around, I've spent too many weekends not finding any boulders. And so they do a really good job of kind of solving that.
So we're going to go a little bit quicker on this one, just because there's one very specific point I want to make. Despite me claiming that you can be my best friend if you like face pulls, I still don't see that many people falling in love with them like I am, or I should say we are. But this climb is a great example of how useful they can be and why external rotation strength of the shoulders is so useful. So as we get to this point, let's see right here. So as he's coming over, this is going to be the prime example of the face pull motion. So his hand obviously is not going to move, but his body relatively is trying to push forward towards the next hold. So he's trying to move towards the next hold. His hand obviously is going to stay in the exact same spot, but his body relatively is going to be driving forward towards that hold. This is, you can see, the face pull position. Now, his body, due to simple gravity, also wants to be pulling in the exact opposite direction, meaning a ton of force and pressure is coming onto the shoulder here. In the face pull, as we get through that external rotation, we are driving everything back, but relatively when we're here, it's going to drive our chest forward. So that strength is really important, not only to create stability and avoid injury, but obviously to just help him as he tries to move over onto that next hold. So if you don't have the strength, you may not be able to make that next move, and you may end up on the pads. All right, let's take a look at this indoor climb.
Pretty smooth so far. Nice jump.
Moving pretty quickly. Whop.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's fun.
Yeah.
Ooh, that looks tough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that toe looks pretty hard. Like it'd be hard to move off from that. But what do you think about the positioning here of that toe and like how he's going to try and go to that next hold, Dan?
Yeah, it looks like he's really bound. Like his feet are quite high for this. So to some extent, the right foot being this high is going to push him off of these holds, which look relatively slopey. And he's a little bit closer than one typically wants to be with a toe hook. If you're really good at toe hooks, you can of course make this work, but it doesn't seem like necessarily a super well leveraged technique here. If you were to get a hook on this guy, I would probably try a heel instead. Typically heel hooks work closer to the body than toe hooks do. And it'll also kind of let him articulate around the knee a little bit more as he kind of tracks up and across this way. So if you were to try to jam on the toe hook, I would try to sag and stand across this way before going up. That's going to let you kind of get further to the right and kind of activate the toe hook by getting it to be more of a sort of like straighter side pull. Potentially you could do a little bit of a combination and use the toe hook to bump your hand a little bit like he does here, at which point you can track the right knee a little bit into the left. That's going to require some spinal mobility, but it'll let you kind of like tilt your hips to turn the left toe to a heel. And that'll probably let you pin across a little bit more easily to get up to this thing. That said, I noticed that there's a black foothold over here. And it actually kind of looks like there's not a super straightforward way to set up this hook. Like he could potentially walk his feet down like left foot, right foot, and then left heel or something. But then it'll be a fairly long reach. So the point there really is just like, it doesn't look like this is set to be done with a hook. Not that you can't make it, but it doesn't look like that was the intended method. And it's always worth considering what the creators had in mind, since Mother Nature is not really playing that role here. So I would guess that the intended beta was to have a left foot where his right foot is, a right foot over here, and then kind of just like dunk it to this hold. That probably will just work better. Even if he keeps the hook on here, he's going to be a little extended, kind of pulling along this guy, and it's going to be a little tricky to get into the plumb line. So probably just walk your feet to the right and dunk it on up there. But those are a couple of tips with selection of hooks, basically heels if they're close, toes if they're far, and trying to turn your hips to face wherever you're placing the hook to make it easier to get the mobility to put it on, and then opening them back up to engage it. As a very quick final point, we're not going to touch on this too much, but he does 2 jump moves. And this is another thing that I see people do a lot, so I'm sure we'll cover it in more detail somewhere else. But when you jump to things, you have kind of 2 options. Boom. So he sucks his knees up in front of him, which gets you into this kind of like bowling ball sort of position. Pulls your spine back, pulls your shoulders back, and it changes the angles on your wrists to be kind of coming off of the holds like this.
Which it looks like maybe he has some wrist pain because he's wearing a wrist widget.
Yeah, 2 wrist widgets actually.
Oh.
Uh-oh, sorry about that. I wouldn't expect this to bother your wrist particularly. It's just same deal here, right? So he hits it, and I think people try to maintain tension by sort of curling up into a ball. Where's the other jump move? Oh, here it is. Yeah, whop. And so see how he kind of like arcs up and has his knees in front of him. So the problem with that, typically, it's not like horrendous in this case, but it pulls your hands in sort of gravity backwards. And this is why you do that sort of scorpion technique where you want to kind of face pull and arc your body in. That lets your legs kind of swing out behind you. The kind of purpose there is that while you have to dissipate this momentum somehow, you want to do it in a way that moves your hands and forearms as little as possible so that you can have the most advantageous kind of line of force on the holds. So details elsewhere, but scorpions are generally easier than this sort of like knees in front position. Knees back, not knees in front.
Dreamscape. Oh, heel.
At
Nice
Index,
rail.
Washington.
Washington.
Yeah.
Very mossy.
Cool spot.
Lots of good heel engagement. Keeping the toe, trying to point it out. Okay. Oh, all right. Let's go back to right where he comes off. Right. So you can clearly just kind of see that when he tries to get the bump, his knee immediately like drives into the wall and the hips are already kind of falling away as he's trying to come up. Sometimes that's not even a strength issue. It's just kind of trying to keep the glutes engaged because those are going to push you further into the wall without smashing you back off and away, which is obviously going to make it harder to catch and make you much further away from the actual hold. Whereas if you compare that just to a separate beta video, we can see the same beta, the same movements, the same setup, but he keeps his hips much more open and the hips way closer to the wall. And so as he makes that initial movement, he stays close, and then he falls away, but he's already got that span and that distance to get up to the next hold, which allows him to latch it. So even just some awareness, not even necessarily strength, of the glutes to push yourself forward into the wall when you're doing that type of movement can make the subtle difference from falling off and latching and sending.
When you're trying to do like a high step in general, you tend to have, I guess there's maybe some exceptions, but like generally speaking, you want to be open-hipped. And when you're open-hipped, it's important that your knees are turned out enough that when you drive across them, they don't just go into the wall. So you need to have enough mobility and enough kind of like strength and activation in those ranges that as you're driving up on your foot, your knee tracks kind of like parallel instead of any other way. It's kind of like your only option. If it's not turned like that, you're just pinned as soon as your knee gets to the wall. Well, probably lots of people are going to recognize this one, an absolute classic of the Southeast. Fans, I think, are crucial in the summer, but you know what else is? Trimming your videos. Anyways, we're off. Pretty good, pretty clean. Should probably be moving just a little faster. I don't see any like inefficient movement, but for a climb this steep and kind of slopey, it's gonna cost you to take kind of any extra time. But yeah, clean and precise. We are going at full speed, right? Okay.
That was a very subtle jab.
Yeah, I like the heel placement. Being on that knob instead of on the flat, it kind of helps push him into the hold as well as kind of pulling down and opposing the left foot. Good cut. No, buddy, no.
Blump.
I feel everything about this. Boulders are meant to be 5 or fewer moves. A few things here. I mean, the first, of course, is just like if you can climb faster on steep angles, that'd be great. A generally good sort of rule of thumb, and this is one of the reasons I like filming climbs, is like not only do you get to see your movement, but you can kind of see how long it typically takes you to do a boulder. Generally, a good rule of thumb is about 2 seconds a move. That's like pretty quick, but not in any sense like rushed. But if it gets way longer than that, you may want to look at things. And so we're starting at about 48 seconds here. He does 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 moves in about 45 seconds. So that's almost 5 seconds a move. Not ferociously slow, but you're definitely not doing yourself any favors. So I would try to time my climbs and work on climbing consistently fast in the gym. Outside, I think it's best to kind of just go at whatever rate feels natural to you. It can be a little inefficient to try to like force yourself to do things in a cadence that you're not used to. But definitely in the gym, it's worth trying to climb faster. Additionally, just having a big old fuel tank, power endurance for boulders, like we've talked about before, goes a really long way towards both flashing things and being able to just like really kind of put the nail in your project as opposed to getting to the end and gassing out here. The final thing though is sort of thinking about opposition. This heel hook kind of unloads his side pull instead of providing force into it. I think there is a little bit of a nub at the bottom of this rail that he's getting to push into some, but it's still just not a super supportive position. If one looks at other beta videos, you'll notice that while people do make this heel hook work sometimes, it's very much not the typical method. Almost always they do one of two things. Either from this lower position, they cross above and match this guy, which is kind of a better hold. You take a rip there and it puts you into immediate opposition, kind of smearing against the wall on the foot. Or they get into a similar position that he's in here, but they instead of putting a heel on, they place a toe right at the bottom of this thing, which pushes you directly into this hand. So it's probably a little bit more physical, but I think that one probably provides like the most controlled, comfortable movement. So either of those two would work. And it's kind of useful that you can just sort of pop over to Kaya here and see. I guess they have 21 different beta videos for this. So pretty efficient way to kind of like check yourself after you've gone out and tried it, or possibly to procure some different beta options before you leave for your trip.
All right, so this is Dustin Dudley. He actually just recently started a YouTube channel for climbers. And it's an interesting one because he is actually 6'6" and 335. So his channel is called The Big Climber. But this one, I just found it to be like an interesting overall point about the effect on mobility of our lower extremity and how it impacts our upper extremity. So when we are in this type of position, if we actually don't have good mobility in the hips, it's going to push us further away from the wall, which then actually just makes this movement even harder. So when he's on these two holds, these like just little double Gaston, he's kind of pulling into like a face pull like movement. Now, the closer his body is in towards the wall, the easier it will be to stand on those feet. But it's just a neat demonstration of if you don't have the hip mobility to be able to do that and stay close to the wall, it actually drastically increases the strain and stress on the shoulders to try and pull yourself in closer. So I think sometimes people are like, oh, the research can't say this or that about hip mobility, but you also have to think of it practically. And this application shows a clear demonstration of how hip mobility can actually take stress off of your shoulders, which then makes the rest of the climb a little bit easier and isn't as taxing.
Absolutely. So I guess I have just a couple of small things. I think these are kind of quick macro pieces of advice that are hopefully quite useful for newer climbers, but are still worth considering as sort of more veteran climbers. The first one, and I see this happen all the time in the gym, is that it's good to think about the first move, or establishing on the wall rather, as the first move of the climb. A lot of times people don't really think about where their body needs to be to establish on the climb, whether it's a stand start or a sit start. And because of that, very often your off foot, the one still on the ground, is either almost always too far away from the wall. In some cases with overhangs, they'll be too close to the wall, but typically people are too far from the wall. And the result of this is that when you pull on to establish, you really kind of like thunk into the wall. So see how he kind of like bonks in here and then has to come back down and establish. So this is just because he's way too far out and kind of not quite far enough to the right. So if he'd sort of like bring his foot into about here and then kind of sag a little bit down and right so that he's already kind of loading that side pull when he pulls off of the ground, it's going to be a much gentler, sort of like floatier experience, and he'll just be directly into this position. So a lot of times you'll see somebody like set up, grip up on a hold, put their foot on, get ready to go, and have to take this little swing. Not that big of a deal, but the harder the position gets, the kind of more it makes a difference that you get this kind of unnecessary clunk. The same thing can happen, though, is a little bit more rare. If you start too close in, and you have to fight this little swing to establish at the start of the climb. So all you want to do is just think about it as if it's a hangboard, or if you're climbing into that position in sequence, and try to find a spot where your foot is more or less balanced with where you're going to establish. And when you pull on, no extra noise, no extra movement. Nice and smooth. From there, a couple really small things. Gastons are going to be significantly harder the more angled they are. And so in this case, it's hard to tell like what the exact shape or in-cut of the hold is, but if he's able to shift his hands down just a little bit, it's going to be a lot less stressful on his shoulder trying to just spread like this, and he'll be able to support his weight and the feet more. Secondarily, it's going to add a little bit of complexity, but it's potentially a good idea to start crossed for the same reason. So he'll be able to take the best part of the hold with the hand that's staying on the wall. Worth trying. These things vary in different situations, but generally speaking, the closer to a down pull something is, the easier life's going to be, unless you're relying on that opposition, of course. So this is all good. Clever idea with the clamp foot here to help kind of like maintain opposition and resist his move across this way. If your hip flexibility is inadequate for this type of move, it also works to just kind of flag out this way. That'll provide counterbalance for the move across as well, and it doesn't require the precision and the hip mobility of stepping the foot on. But this is a good method and cleverly done, especially for a newer climber. From here, this is another kind of classic mistake of newer climbers is you want to use the feet as much as possible to try to support yourself. And so people go kind of hunting around trying to choose among the various options here. But every single one of these feet is too high and is pushing him off of this handhold. So you want to support the movement, but in some cases using the wrong feet will actually lift you off of the holds. And so his best bet in this case is to actually just flag down or smear near the corner of the wall, which is going to let him kind of sag and not exactly fall, but gravity's going to be kind of pulling him down to try to fall off the wall this way, which is going to engage him onto the left-hand Gaston for a relatively easy match. Once he's matched, then he'll be able to drive off of these feet, kind of whichever one he likes best to set up on this hold. Without kind of coming into match, he now doesn't really have opposition, and he's either faced with a fairly hard bump for the grade, or trying to cross in directly with the right somehow, which is just not really going to work. Final point, good creativity, good kind of searching around and problem solving. Doodle-doodle-doo. Okay, so he does the first one of these moves fairly nicely. In this case, the high left foot, I think, is probably not a great idea. He's not going really very far here, and so he doesn't need the boost from the foot, but it does support the movement and makes the pull-up a little bit easier, so it's not a bad idea. And he does a good job here of kind of sagging and then generating. Bop. But as soon as he sticks this, he now does another classic kind of movement pattern, which is he moves his foot up even higher and pulls really high on these hands. This is going to make these about as bad as they could possibly be, pulling directly out on the holds, while also really shorting his ability to generate. So pretty much always when you're trying to initiate a movement, you want to be relatively bent in the legs and relatively straight in the hands. That's going to give you the longest motion to generate through. And so you don't need to engage with as much. You kind of have more time to create the motion, and so you don't need to pull as hard or lock off with as much difficulty. And so by starting straight arm bent legs, you can stand up naturally, and it's going to be as sort of fluid and easy as that move could be. So anyways, those are kind of the main takeaways that I have there. Start closer to the wall, try to find opposition. Sometimes feet can sabotage you, and initiate with straight arms.
Just listen.
I was watching him get higher and higher on a climb called Don't Fall, and I'm like, oh no.
Agony.
Yeah, all right,
you know what that means.
Brief departure from our normal movement feedback here to some general tactical advice. First and foremost is falling into the crack on pads sucks, especially when you're high off the ground, and it seems like climbers frequently are just crack-seeking missiles. I don't know why, but please don't. There are a couple ways to avoid this. One, of course, is to have something like a pro spotter from Asana or any kind of thin blubber pad kind of thing to cover the cracks. The nice thing is that it keeps you from having part of your ankle on one and your heel off, so you don't get nearly as much torque even if you do separate it. But with drag pads like that, it's important to make sure that you scooch the pads together in between attempts. Otherwise, you can potentially have a really thin pad just covering a gaping hole, which we don't want. If you're in a situation like this where you're on a relatively high climb with presumably no spotter, probably somewhat in the wilderness, I would err on the side of having the pads a little bit further from the wall. You may fall at the start and miss them, which of course isn't ideal, but it's much better to fall low and miss the pads than to fall high and miss the pads. A trick that I was taught forever ago when people had fewer pads, and so you'd be frequently out on climbs with one pad even with friends, just get some sticks or rocks or pine cones or whatever, and you just throw them at the wall at various points, and typically where it bounces off is more or less where you're going to fall, assuming that there's not a big swing. So climbers do tend to hop off of the wall a little bit. When you fall, you just kind of release. If you expect that there's a jump move that you could blow it at an apex, you're going to have to kind of move back from there. But typically, yeah, just kind of the bounce test works really well and gives you a good idea of where-ish the falls are going to be and where the pad should be placed. I guess the last thing, and this kind of goes back to previous videos, is more endurance for boulderers and practice down climbing helps you escape things like this or be able to somewhat more confidently evaluate the top out on the fly. So, be careful and bring extra tools.
If you want one of your videos to be featured in a future Anatomy of the Climb episode, be sure to follow us on Instagram and on YouTube because that is where we put out the callouts for when we want new videos. And then until next time, all of our SoCal climbers, be sure to check out the new tramway guide and of course the Bishop guide.